Hi, welcome to Pop Culture Maniacs' podcast. This week, your host is me, Kieran Freemantle, and joining me is our TV editor, Henegan. This week, we'll be talking about the nostalgia trend and particularly how it's been weaponized. So, Jean, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Kieran. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. So, yes, let's go straight to it because in popular culture at the moment, nostalgia is pretty big. I think there's no denying that. I think I see it's in two ways. You've got the sort of cynical corporate side where people see, yeah, that's popular. Let's try and make money from that. And the bottom half of author writers or whatever, because they're influenced by stuff that they grew up. And I think with our generation, they're now starting to become creators that are becoming pretty big creators themselves in TV and film. So I think, and there's always been a nostalgia trend as well. So shall we say, I think the most obvious place to start would be the top-down approach, since I think that's how most people have interpreted this nostalgia boom has come about. So Disney, shall we say, is a great example of this nostalgia boom, remaking pretty much all their animated classics for cynical money-making reasons, buying Lucasfilm and pretty much rebooting everything they can get their hands on.
Yep. I mean, one of my biggest pop culture pet peeves over the last several years is the live action, should be in quotes, live action remakes of Disney cartoons that have gotten so ridiculous that now with Lion King, it's essentially the same movie with one of the same voice actors, but with CGI instead of hand-drawn animation, which to me is just, it was ridiculous. I cannot, it just drives me nuts that Disney just does these cynical things just to make more money. When really, just re-release the cartoon in theaters. People will still go see it. It's still a classic, but drives me nuts.
Exactly. Well, then you wouldn't have a reason to get Disney Plus. Well, actually, you wouldn't have a reason to go and see this film at the cinema if you got Disney Plus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, with the Star Wars trilogy essentially being a remake of the original trilogy.
Yeah. Well, especially the first one was pretty much a New Hope remade, just with a few minor alterations. Second one dared to be different and a very vocal set of fans brought in uproar, and so hence J.J. Abrams had to come in again to pretty much remake Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity to really do something new.
Yeah, and I think with just generally there's so many properties getting rebooted at the moment. I think at the time of recording, we've got Hulu have just released the Maniacs reboot, which they pretty much brought back most of the original cast members, and Peacock have a Saved by the Bell Self-Aware reboot. So that's two properties from the 90s there.
Yep, and then there's talk that they might do a remake of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Yeah.
Which would just be disappointing. Just come up with a new idea. Just new ideas aren't that hard to come up with. Just give it a chance.
Yes, but we need that. They need that brand recognition, don't they?
We need guaranteed viewers and money.
Yeah, though I'm of the view that no matter if it's a reboot or an original idea, quality normally comes to the top.
Absolutely. The early reviews for the Saved by the Bell are actually kind of positive, which I was surprised.
Yeah, as I think because seeing the trailer for it, it was quite a self-aware remake. So like one of the main characters, she was pretty much the Zach Morris replacement, but instead of being like a rich preppy, she was the sort of fairly normal and this is weird. People driving it, high school kids driving around in fancy cars and all that.
Which is not all that normal in American high schools, I have to say.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That perhaps the image of that's projected from American TV and the reality are probably very different.
I mean, I went to a private Catholic high school, and we definitely had some kids who drove around in very expensive cars, but it wasn't a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think, um, as I said, I think this nostalgia reflection thing has always been around. Like writing down some of this, like in the 70s, we had like Happy Days. 80s, we had the Wonder Years, which was set in the 70s. We would have had in the 90s that 70s show. Now we've got like things like Stranger Things and the Goldbergs, which is really building on the 80s nostalgia. I think it's particularly 80s nostalgia which is prominent in popular culture. I think the nostalgia boom involving the 80s has lasted longer than the 80s itself.
Yeah, although we've seen the 90s nostalgia start creeping in with like shows like Pen 15, which is very much late 90s, early 2000s. Because as you mentioned, as the filmmakers and television writers get to a certain age and get a certain amount of power within the industry, then they start reflecting back on their childhoods. And our generation, with like the 90s kids and early 2000s, are just starting to get that level of recognition. So I suspect the next 5 years we're going to get hit with a bunch of 90s reboots.
Oh yeah, yeah. Admittedly, I think if Disney announced that they were going to do a Gargoyles revival or reboot, and they got Keith David back to voice Goliath, I think I would be pretty excited about that, as long as they had a good team of writers.
I would watch that in a
Yeah.
heartbeat.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you sort of obviously it's various things obviously have different approaches. Like I was going to say, let's compare, say, Goldbergs and Dairy Girls quickly. Goldbergs obviously set in the 80s, pretty broad sitcom. And obviously, I think the timeline is so skilled. You have things from like 1981, like watch it, like hacking and war games and all that, and they go all the way to like 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So yeah, there's no timeline consistency there. Whilst something like Dairy Girls, it's specific. You can tell it's all like specifically set in like 1994, 1995, because with references of both pop cultural things at the time, like Usual Suspects, Pulp Fiction, and then historical events like Bill Clinton's visit to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's also a kind of a what the shows want to convey with like something like that 70s show, which essentially ran out of the 70s, and the Goldbergs, which really has run out of the 80s, and you get kind of boxed in, and you can't, when you start anchoring yourself to specific historical moments, you kind of get boxed in with what you can and can't do.
Yeah. I think with someone like Lisa McGee, the creator of Dairy Girl, she did base it on her own childhood. I think she grew up before the Dairy Girls, but they like it. Well, as she said that she remembered it. It wasn't all, bombing and sectarian violence. They were people also living normal lives and growing up. They just happened to be growing up in a very troubled time.
Yeah, and I suspected that show, it's gonna slowly move closer and closer to the Good Friday agreement and get that.
I think, I was thinking something like that. It's going to last. It's going to have a third season, and let's talk about a film. And I think that will be it. Compared to say the American studio thing, you just run it into the ground, like something like Simpsons. That's been run into the ground, and it's sort of like, because like one of the most infamous episodes was the 90s show, which they kind of reboot the timeline, which the Simpsons is such a 90s product.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are lucky though, because you don't have the push for syndication like we do. If you hit 100 episodes, you get syndication, and so you make money forever, which is why so many of our shows go so long.
And obviously, this nostalgia trend has sort of gone way beyond just say film and TV, because I think just this year we had 2 video game reboots, like Battletoads and Streets of Rage, so popular video games from the 90s, getting revamped, new art styles, became quite popular digital releases. And Sonic Mania a few years ago was pretty much trying to recapture that 90s glory of the Sonic the Hedgehog games. There is quite a bit going on there. If we go back to say something like authorship as well, because something like Doctor Who, that was partly revitalised in the UK because there were a lot of people, Doctor Who fans, that group, and they ended up coming pretty senior in the BBC, became senior writers. Russell T Davies was a big Doctor Who fan. He was pretty much spearheaded the revival when a lot of people thought it just wouldn't be a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, just in my own family, my dad was a big Doctor Who fan growing up, and when the revival hit, he was so excited to get to show it to his kids because it was such a key formative part of his childhood as well.
Yeah. And I think there's also an actor side from it as well for these revivals and reboots, because I remember like in the mid-2000s there were quite a few continuations of series that were long dead. So 2006, Sylvester Stallone did Rocky Balboa. 2007, you got we had Bruce Willis returning for a fourth Die Hard, and then in 2008 you had Harrison Ford doing the Indiana Jones 4 and Sylvester Stallone doing Rambo 4. So it's essentially this fallback position for a lot of actors if their career's on a wane, just return to your popular franchise. And if it was at 2022, we're going to have The Matrix 4 as well. Though I think that's more to save Lana Wachowski's career rather than revitalise Keanu Reeves' career.
Yeah, I think Keanu's doing pretty well. But
yeah.
I mean, I'm intrigued for... I mean, I'm not a huge action fan, so I didn't really get into any of the... I mean, I watched Indiana Jones 4, which was a mess, but I'm intrigued with what they can do with The Matrix after kind of the way the original trilogy just fell apart at the end in disappointing ways.
At the same time, though, for Matrix 4, I'm a bit concerned. I think the series did end, humans and machines, they've made peace. Most of the main characters of the Matrix rebooted. I don't know how they're gonna continue it.
I don't know how they're gonna bring these dead characters back, which is gonna be the interesting thing.
Or something like again, thinking something like Lord of the Rings, obviously very popular, and even then they didn't wait long for the nostalgia train got doing the Hobbit films. The third one was pretty much all fan service and baiting fans with all the references, and now we're getting the Lord of the Rings TV show as well for Amazon. So there's just no let up on that front.
And one of the big TV returns was Twin Peaks coming back with a strange final season that a lot of people were hoping for some answers that didn't really get any answers, but got some really crazy, weird filmmaking choices, which I found enjoyable, but I know a lot of the average Twin Peaks fans were not happy with what they got.
I've never seen Twin Peaks, so I can't fairly judge. I think of the Simpsons quote, like, this is brilliant, amazing, insightful. I have no clue what's going on.
Yeah, that pretty much sums up the experience of watching the Twin Peaks new season.
Yeah, I would say, as well as sort of these direct references to, say, setting shows in or films in a certain era. I mean, there are other films like Guardians of the Galaxy is very much products of the 80s, even if it's not actually set in the 80s, because you've got obviously the 80s, 70s and 80s soundtrack, pretty much the visuals are pretty much 80s. Same with something like Thor Ragnarok as well. It's essentially Flash Gordon, but with Thor. So you got that, and obviously, I think this goes back to our original point. Like directors, they are influenced by things that they grew up with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the creative minds that are prevalent, that are directing the nostalgia train. I mean, the Duffer Brothers with Stranger Things, like they've been very open that it's a story that they want to tell that harken back to their own childhoods, and it hits a chord with a lot of people who are just the right age for that. And I'm just a little bit too young for Stranger Things to really hit for me like that, since I was born in the '80s. But I mean, even to me, it's comforting to kind of see that, that the way they film scenes just harkens back to like watching E.T. or those kind of big '80s movies. It does calm you and kind of make you content when you watch them.
And again, it's something that made me think of like things like Family Guy and American Dad. There's sort of like Seth MacFarlane just loves shoving in references to things that he loved when he was younger. So Back to the Future, Star Trek, Star Wars, and all that. Some episodes are pretty much remakes of certain things. They say E.T., or in fact, American Dad episode was a remake of E.T. Another Family Guy episode was pretty much a remake of Poltergeist. So you get that sort of parody level as well.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting to look at the difference between like the parody levels and then the really earnest nostalgia tinged shows. Because I think, with the comedies like, That 70s Show or Goldbergs, there's a hint of like the nostalgia, but it's mostly kind of a parody of some of the ridiculous things that you get in the 80s and 70s. But then you get, something that's like Stranger Things. It's very earnest about what the 80s were and the nice things about them, kids riding bikes, and takes that nostalgia and twists it in an interesting way to bring in the horror aspect as well.
Yeah. And that was the thing with like, well, nostalgia is we're always going to be, everyone's going to be nostalgic to a certain point of their lives. I think we've both pretty been nostalgic for things from the 90s, yet we probably ignored not so good things from the 90s, and say like our parents probably were nostalgic for 60s and 70s, again ignoring the sort of not so good things.
My parents, one of their favorite movies from the 80s was The Big Chill, which was, kind of started the nostalgia trend for like 60s style music. And like here in the States, we had a bunch of like oldies stations that would just play like 50s, 60s, and like early 70s music as a result of that kind of igniting the nostalgia for their childhood.
Yeah. Isn't it like something like American Graffiti as well? Like, didn't that help start like the 50s nostalgia that America had as well? Like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
And obviously because, and again, this is like a Family Guy joke, but like saying like, I'm assuming there is a little bit of truth in it. That the 50 diners were very popular in the 80s.
Yeah, like the state of New Jersey still has a bunch of diners. But yeah, we've a lot of like the 50s kind of like, I mean, in Pulp Fiction, it's not incorrect to have a diner like that, in the early 90s, late 80s, where it would be very 1950s style with, I don't know, sock hop, poodle skirt situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Same with like, something like this is quite a distressing thought for me, like something like Hot Fuzz, the Killers album, and you think that's 16 years old now, and you think, Christ, I'm old.
Yeah, I just was talking to someone today about when I started college, and I was like, oh my gosh, it was 16 years ago. That's insane. How has it been that long?
Yeah. And there's also like I was saying, there's within the internet as well, there's sort of like a cottage industry of nostalgia. Yes, I am aware of the irony that we are a part of this cottage industry of nostalgia, so I do not need this pointed out. but it's sort of like loads of YouTubers now. Sort of, you could argue it started like with people like the angry video game nerd and nostalgia critic, like looking back on the video games they grew up, the films they grew up. They were, well, I would say purely comedy, but if you watch nostalgia critic, yeah, comedy term is being used very loosely there. And now, but now, like, you get loads of people, they do video essays on all sorts, modern and new, modern and old films, TV shows, or whatever, what made them work. Obviously, with plenty of websites, they might churn out a top 10 list of something that they grew up, that the author grew up with. I think like Screen Rants at the moment, they do a lot of things on Avatar: The Last Airbender list, lots of lists on that. So this nostalgia trend is coming from all sorts of angles.
Yeah, I mean, adverts have absolutely jumped onto the nostalgia trend as well. It feels like it's everywhere, but it seems to work. I mean, people want, especially now in the current climate, people want things that make them feel comfortable and remind them of a time when they were presumably happier and more content and could, go see their families without worrying about bringing a plague to them. So I suspect in the next 6 months or so, it's really going to have a lot more nostalgia turned up in every area of media.
Then you get the other sort of side of the nostalgia. Like, I read the novel Ready Player One, and yesterday or the day before recording, I watched the film, and you think it's so like that is just pretty much 80s reference just chucked at you. Especially with the book, because I mean, it is like sort of like a lot of the challenges were like. So one challenge was you had to play an old arcade game, which wouldn't have been very cinematic. There was pretty much some of the challenges where you had to pretty much redo a film word for word, something like War Games or Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Sort of, you could argue it's just a more cynical nostalgia bait.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm kind of the person that always looks at something as more cynical than it's a genuine thing. You have to prove to me that it's not just a cynical nostalgia bait.
So I think that's been quite an illuminating discussion we've had there, Gene. So only covered quite a bit in a shorter amount of time than usual for us. To our listeners, thank you very much. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, like us on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever your social media of choice is. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And all the best. Bye.